All right, so I'm speaking on John Paul II, Consciousness, and Humanae Vitae. So I'm going to do a really quick comparison and contrast between Thomism and personalism as we go through this. For years, I went to a conference at Notre Dame run by Ralph McInerney, a Thomism workshop for a week or so, I think it was. It was just spectacular, where you brought together young people, professors, graduate students from around the United States, and we learned a lot about Thomism, but it really did bring together like-minded people and we have friendships now for decades because of those. And this is very much what that is. I think you're an opportunity to really meet people you'll have lifetime contacts, and you're learning more about personalism. We didn't know much about it years ago. I've been trying to learn about it over the years. John Paul II basically called himself a Thomistic personalist, or you could say a personalist Thomist. I'm being generous today because I'm with the personalists, so I'm saying Thomistic personalist. I could have said personalist Thomist, which would make the Thomist the more fundamental thing, but why quibble? Why quibble? All right, so Thomas knew that ethics requires John Paul II knew that ethics requires an anthropology, and anthropology requires metaphysics, and in a sense, therefore, he accepted the metaphysics of Thomas. I don't think he was much interested in metaphysics, but he knew he had to have one, and he knew Thomas had a good one, so he accepted that. And of course, he liked the Thomistic anthropology, the really precise understanding of faculties, etc. John Paul II criticized modern philosophy because it rejected metaphysics, and it had a false materialistic anthropology. Yet he was drawn to modern philosophy because of its interest in consciousness. All right, this was a very important concept for him. He has a very interesting sort of epistemological understanding of consciousness. Here I'm going to be talking more about, he does use the word consciousness, but it's more about a being conscious. And it means much more than being aware, but we'll talk about that, being conscious of things in order to guide your action. I have an essay called Universality and Natural Law and the Irreducibility of Personalism. When I give that talk, almost nobody comes. But if I have an audience that might be interested, maybe you're that audience. All right, the universality almost of natural law and the irreducibility, the interest of personalism in irreducibility. That's in this book. And it's based a great deal on Wojtyła's essay, Subjectivity and the Irreducible in the Human Being. That's in his text, Person and Community. So I'm going to do a quick review of the different views of the human person within Thomism and in Wojtyła's personalism. Aquinas' view of the person is that the person is an individual substance of a rational nature. He should live in accord with that nature. He should live in accord with his rationality. Anybody who has a slight acquaintance with Aquinas knows that position. The individual person is one of many rational creatures, many other human beings, who have an elevated place in the hierarchy of beings. And the human dignity is rooted in man's ability to know universal truths and act in accord with them. John Paul II would accept all of that, but he actually thinks it's somewhat inadequate. He speaks about the fact that in Aquinas there is no analysis of consciousness. And this is Wojtyła. He says, it almost seems as though there is no place in it, Aquinas' view of the person, for an analysis of consciousness and self-consciousness as a totally unique manifestation of the person as a subject. For Thomas, the person is, of course, a subject, a very distinctive subject of existence and activity, and because the person has subsistence in a rational nature, and this is what makes the person capable of consciousness and self-consciousness. So there's people now who are writing that Thomas had a view of consciousness, but Wojtyła didn't find it, all right? He thought it wasn't there. And I do think there's something that wasn't there that the personalists find, but I do think there's the foundation for consciousness for certain within Aquinas' anthropology. So John Paul II, we'll start seeing some of the differences here. A person has dignity because by nature he is made to love and be loved. Now you can't do that unless you're rational and free, but the The payoff for John Paul II is that we can love and be loved. And the person must live a life of self-giving. He should never be used. Now, if you've read John Paul II, Love and Responsibility and Theology of the Body, you know that these are themes throughout there. A person has consciousness that he can know the truth and he must live in accord with the truth. So it's not just simply that he can know the truth and must live in accord with the truth, but there's an emphasis that he's conscious of that about himself, right? And that's where he knows his own dignity, right? Each person's unique journey and commitments are of interest. And that's a difficult philosophical position because philosophy is interested in universal truths and general truths. It's hard to find a place for the particular within philosophy, right? You can find it in poetry, you can find it in scripture, but it's harder to find a place for it in philosophy. So just to talk a minute about what the irreducible means and maybe some difference between, again, Thomism and personalism. There's different philosophical categories. There's a genus that we're all in, and we're all in the genus of being. We're all in the larger species of animal. Then we have a subspecies. A defining characteristics is that we are rational animals. And that's about where Thomas gets, right? We're all rational animals. But this irreducibility, the Voitian irreducibility, is looking for something particularly true about the individual. He calls it pausing at the irreducible, pausing at the irreducible. So that includes personal characteristics or accidents. Again, philosophy is not much interested in accidents except kinds of accidents, categories of accidents. But particular accidents are kind of like, you know, what does that have to do with anything? And so if you're describing me, I'm a female, I'm an American, I'm a PhD, I'm unmarried, and I teach in a seminary. But you're still not getting at me. There's other women in this room that refers to as well. But what is absolutely irreducible, and what is the concrete particular that I am, is I'm the second daughter of John and Ann Smith. I'm Janet. There's no other one, right? So that's when you get to the irreducible, it means that there's no smaller category that I can fit into than that particular category right there. And John Paul II says there has to be some way for philosophy to show interest in that very particular person, the individual. Now this is also, again, quite fast, but I just want to be attentive to these different terms that are used in the tradition and then what John Paul II does. And you'll see this throughout, now even church teaching. It's come into church documents. But the tradition has always spoken about the human person as being rational. And often where we would find rational before, now we find conscious or self-conscious. Right? You'll see that man is not just rational animal, he's a self-conscious or a conscious animal. We're free, whereas Voitius talks about it as being self-determining, right? The tradition talks about being social, whereas personalism speaks of us being self-giving, right? We talk about virtue within the tradition, and Voitius speaks about self-mastery. And the tradition speaks about human beings must live rationally, and Voitius says that human beings must make a gift of self. Now you look at everything on the right-hand column presupposes everything in the left-hand column. It needs everything in the left-hand column. You couldn't have any one of those concepts without the concepts in the left-hand column. But the left-hand column is all universal. And the right-hand column is driving towards, in a certain sense, the particular individual, the self, the self, the self, right? So he's trying to make room for the self within the whole analysis of human personhood and human action. So again, just to flesh these out a little bit more, to say that someone is rational means that the individual can grasp universal truths. To say that someone is self-conscious, again, is to say that someone is conscious of oneself as knowing universal truths. And it means like a bit more than that. It means I know that's a great thing. That I can know universal truths means that I'm something special in the universe, right? Not just as a kind of thing, but I as a person am quite spectacular because I can know universal truths. In a tradition, we're free. We're capable of making choices, and freedom means the human person is not coerced to do something. Whereas Voitius puts the emphasis on being self-determining, We're conscious that we can choose good or evil, and that we should choose in accord with the truth. What I actually should put here is that we're forming ourselves with every one of those choices. We're making ourselves something with those choices. And now it certainly is true in Aquinas that he believes that every choice is self-determining. But the emphasis and again, the terminology with Wojtyła keeps showing how much important this is, that when I should be conscious, when I'm making my choices, that I'm making myself into a certain sort of person. I'm forming myself. It's not just that I'm, and I shouldn't use the word just here, but it's not that I'm just, can't find a better word at the moment, doing what is right or wrong. That is impacting, it's imminent, it does something to my character. The tradition says we're social, and that means basically we need other people to survive. We cannot be totally self-sufficient. Some of us are hardly have a moment of our existence that's self-sufficient. We're so dependent upon others and in so many ways. But the shift here to self-giving is very important. I mean, it's not just kind of always when we're in a social relationship with someone, whether my mechanic, I need to treat him as a person, but I'm not really relating to him primarily as a person. I'm relating to him as someone who can fix my car. All right, so the social relationship, being a social animal, means that I need other people to provide for my needs. Whereas the personalist view is man is self-giving. He's meant to love and be loved, and you cannot find yourself without giving yourself. So almost the social relationship of the Aristotelian Thomas, certainly while we make our contribution to others, is we're looking at them as those who can help me meet my needs, and I can help them meet their needs. But self-giving is much more personal, obviously. I give of myself, not just my skills. Again, virtue achieves the perfection suitable to one's being. And we're supposed to all have, in a certain sense, the same virtues. There's the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues, and those are perfective of us qua human being. Whereas, again, Wojtyła speaks about self-mastery. The individual must master his passions so that he can make a gift of himself. So it's not just simply solely the perfection of myself. Some people hostile to Thomism talk sort of like a Michelangelo's David is there. You have the perfect person, and not many of us can reach that. Whereas the personalist is that the reason we master ourselves is so we can be better lovers, really, right? That's and everybody can do that. It's a very individual thing. You don't have to be Michelangelo's David. You need to be you, the lover to the people that are in your lives. So there's a different emphasis we'll quickly review here. Natural law emphasizes universal truths, emphasizes the objectivity of moral norms, that you have to act in accord with the truth. And for instance, a particular instance, human beings should not fornicate because that's not acting in accord with nature. Now again, personalism will presuppose all of those things. It doesn't reject, abandon anything. It needs all of those claims. But when speaking about it, you're looking not at a universal truth that, say, all of our beings can obtain, but there's emphasis on the concrete, particular person, an individual self. There's an emphasis not just on that objectivity of moral norms, but there's a subjective consciousness of the moral norms. And there's a personal commitment to acting in accord with the moral norms. And there it would be, I should not fornicate because it's not in accord with my dignity, with my necessity of making a gift of self. Now, certainly my nature is a part of all of that reasoning that leads me to have that conclusion. But what I'm concerned about is not so much violating nature, it's violating my dignity, the dignity of the other person, not making a proper gift of self. So Thomas and personalists would both agree that our action must be in accord with objective morality, that must be in accord with the natural law. Again, we get this little twist in personalism that's one of the many twists I'm going to focus on today, is the conscious one. Thomism says our actions must be rational, deliberate, to be morally, can be morally evaluated, and it must be free and voluntary. Whereas personalism speaks about the need of the act to be conscious, right, and free, of course. Looks like I have the same. Okay. So the natural law asks this question. Am I respecting the natural end and purpose or telos of the sexual act when it's acting about sexual morality? And there's a kind of caricature of Thomism that we might have an opportunity to speak about this somewhat later, of in Amoris Laetitia, or at least some interpreters of Amoris Laetitia find a caricature. They're based their thinking on a caricature of Thomism. For a moral act, you just simply need to consult with your conscience and find out what rule my action falls under. And then there's a kind of robotic application to a particular situation. You know, I'm thinking of fornicating, that's against nature, I shouldn't do it. Click, click, click. And I actually experience that law as something imposed on me from the outside, that I'm more or less under a very almost dictatorial God or nature that tells me what to do, and I'm here just as kind of someone under the thumb of that God and that nature. Now, that's not true Thomism, but that's how too many people understand Thomism. Now, the personalism, I think, is not at all susceptible to that kind of caricature. Other caricatures, for sure, but not that caricature. And the reason it's not susceptible to that kind of caricature is it asks different questions. Not the question, again, am I respecting the natural end and purpose of the sexual act? But if you go through Wojtyła's work, you'll find a whole different set of questions. Am I respecting the person of anyone, but especially of my own beloved spouse? Are we making gifts of ourselves to each other or using each other? Am I acting in accord with my dignity as one who is meant to love others and make a gift of myself to another? Am I conscious, and this is what we're going to focus a lot on, am I conscious of the meaning of the sexual act and acting in accord with it? And here we have meaning, not nature or purpose, but meaning, which captures much more, I think, than just the word purpose or telos. And another one we won't deal so much with, but very important to John Paul II, especially in Theology of the Body. Am I speaking the truth of the body with my acts? Now, you're going to need the telos and the purpose of the sexual act to know if you're speaking the truth. But we're speaking in a much more personalistic way. Speech is something that only human beings can do. Right? And other things act in accord with their nature, and they act in accord with their telos or their end. But acting in accord with meaning or speaking the truth with my body is really only what human beings can do. I'm going to say a few things about conscience. Next topic. Look at the famous passage from Gaudium et Spes, which some people claim Karol Wojtyła was basically the author of this passage. So in the depths of his conscience, man detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience. Now there we have a certain sense of something that's external, but it's not. He's finding it in the depths of his conscience, all right? Always summoning him to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it, he will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. So here we do have a sense of there's a law that we must abide by. We must obey God. It's God's law. At the same time, it's something that's a part of us. It's deep within us, right? So it's not just on some tablets that God wants to pound over our heads. It's something that he's written in our very deep being, and our dignity relies in obeying it. And we'll see it's much more than obeying. Obedience, honestly, isn't sufficient. We'll see what I mean by that. And Veritas Splendor says this, and this is so much at the heart of John Paul II's thinking about morality. Although each individual has a right to be respected in his own journey in search of the truth, there exists a prior moral obligation, and a grave one at that, to seek the truth and to adhere to it once it is known. So we hear a lot in Amoris Laetitia about accompanying, right, and people. And John Paul II has this, you're meant to be respected in your journey. We're not meant to just, dismiss people or disdain them if they're not where we think they ought to be. But there is a prior moral obligation to this right to be respected, which is that we have to be seeking the truth. Everyone needs to be seeking the truth and then wanting to conform our action to the truth. And again, this isn't, we'll talk much about this, but it's not meant to be felt as this is something imposed upon you from the outside. It's a dictate of your own being, and it's where you recognize that your dignity comes from. Again, that you are able to know the truth and you are able to conform your action to the truth. And that this is not something that you find demeaning. This is the very core of who you are. Simplistic sorts of things, but if you want to be a great basketball player, a great piano player, you don't just go out there and do it your way, right? You say, how is this to be done? The very deepest part of my being wants to achieve this excellence. I have to figure out what is the excellence that's proper to what it is that I want to achieve, and then conform my actions to it. So also, this is in Veritatis Splendor, citing in one portion Gaudium et Spes, patterned on God's freedom. Our freedom is like God's freedom. God's the freest thing there is. So our freedom, man's freedom, is not negated by his obedience to the divine law. Indeed, only through this obedience does it abide in the truth and conform to human dignity. This is clearly stated by the Council. Human dignity requires man to act through conscious, there we see it. Human dignity requires man to act through conscious and free choice, not just rational choice, conscious and free choice, as motivated and prompted personally from within, right? Not feeling the fear of damnation, the fear of a vengeful God, but a conscious choice that this is a good thing to do, and I'm prompted because of something from within, and not through blind eternal impulse or merely external pressure. And it's not altogether wrong to do things because you don't want eternal damnation, right? But he's saying that that's not really enough. That's not enough for human dignity. That's kind of a lesser reason, very much a lesser reason for doing things. It's still a good reason. If that's the best you can do, hold on to it, right? But you want to go further. Veritatis Splendor also speaks of the attractiveness of the law. It says the judgment of conscience does not establish the law. Rather, it bears witness to the authority of the natural law and of the practical reason with reference to the supreme good, whose attractiveness the human person perceives and whose commandments he accepts. Right? So when you hear the law, your response shouldn't be darn, a restriction. It should be terrific knowledge about what makes for excellence. I've been taking tennis lessons forever, and you're just like parents try to teach their children the same thing over and over again. The tennis coach tries to teach me the same thing over and over again, and then one day some days I have an epiphany. I say, oh, that's what you mean, low to high. Low to high, my gosh, I didn't know what low to high meant. Now I do. Now all of a sudden my stroke is 100% better. And you're thinking, that's a truth that it's attractive because I want to be a good tennis player. And I'm accepting it. I'm saying that's what I've wanted to know. So when you hear that, say, fornication is wrong or contraception is wrong, you say, wow, that's not a restriction. Again, that's a liberating truth that's going to allow me to fulfill my nature and get what is best out of this world. Oh, I see a typo right here on the horizon, but I'll endure it. All right. I'm going to talk about the Polish meaning of the word. They don't use G's in Polish, I understand. The Polish meaning of the word conscious. I've read Love and Responsibility many times, and at a certain point, the word conscious just leapt out at me. It was everywhere. And there was an unusual phrase, which I've written an article about, called conscious parenthood, right? And I said, what the heck? That's a strange phrase, conscious parenthood. So I tracked down a Father Louis Madej, who is a Polish priest, a philosopher, and I asked him, I'm sure there's something wrong with the topography of the word there, the Polish word. But I went and said, there's this word, I need to know what it means. It was at Orchard Lake in Michigan, it's a Polish seminary, so we went to the library and we got a Polish version, the original version of Love and Responsibility. And we looked up the word, and he just got visibly excited. He just like, that's a terrific word. He says, you can't capture it in English. He says it connotes a deeply personalistic meaning. It means being vividly aware of some reality, not just aware. You know, we can be conscious that there's someone looking at me and maybe looking at me with hostility. I'm kind of vaguely aware of it. At a certain point, you might become vividly aware of it. It's really determining your action. Yeah, I can't not have that as part of my how I'm responding to reality. And he says it conveys experiencing something with one's emotions as well as one's intellect. He says it meant more than that. It's not only that in the experience of feeling someone hostile to me, that's obviously a negative experience, but consciousness of truth means that I recognize it as true, and then I recognize it as a wonderful truth. All truths are wonderful, but you're saying, wow, again, that's something that changes my whole response to reality. I mean, I'm very blessed that wherever I go, people tell me who've heard contraception, why not, that it's changed their life, right? It's changed their life. Now, I haven't changed their life. It's the truth that's changed their life. And it's to their credit that they heard a truth and they say, whoa, I didn't know that truth. And that truth, it makes all the difference and it's going to change my life. And now I'm committed to acting in accord with that truth. That's what he means by conscious, is that you hear the truth and you say, that's something I want. And I want it so much that I'm going to conform my behavior heretofore on the basis of that truth. And you're not going to put that aside. So other words, he says, that are translated as conscious convey different notions. In one instance, this word translated means something like gut feeling, something deeply experienced of or which one has a deep awareness. In another instance, the word that's translated as conscious means conscious thought. And so there's an intellectual element of it. Again, it's a truth that's satisfying to your intellect and to your being. And then there's also a joy that it's a truth that you see the goodness of, and now you want to, again, conform your life to it. As I've said, that's often not believed to be what Aquinas was talking about. I don't think that's true, but again, it's described in a fuller phenomenological way in many of these passages. I did something here too. All right. The word heteronomy. This is a Kantian term that appears in Veritatis Splendor, which means a law that is other than yourself, something that's imposed upon you from the outside. Heteros means other, nomos means law. And so, again, many people caricature Thomism, look upon the commandments as heteronymous. Kant looked upon the Beatitudes as heteronymous, that Jesus is imposing these upon us, as opposed to, inviting us to be a part of this as being perfective of our being. So Veritatis Splendor says, obedience to God is not, as some would believe, a heteronomy, as if the moral life were subject to the will of something all-powerful, absolute, extraneous to man, and intolerant of his freedom. If, in fact, a heteronomy of morality were to mean a denial of man's self-determination, or the imposition of norms unrelated to his good, this would be in contradiction to the revelation of the covenant and of the redemptive incarnation. Such a heteronomy would be nothing but a form of alienation contrary to divine wisdom and the dignity of the human person. I see another incomplete slide coming up, and I'm hesitant to go there. So I'm going to go, it's not. It's only, okay. God is good. All right, there's this concept in Veritatis Splendor about which much is being done and more needs to be done. And it's the concept of participated theonomy. In Kant and elsewhere, you have this dichotomy between heteronomy, meaning laws imposed without. The state laws are largely that I have to drive a certain speed limit. Someone else has imposed that upon me, and I have to do it or pay a fine. Right? Autonomy means I make my own laws. I decide when I eat breakfast and what I can have for breakfast, and I'm in charge of my own domain. And of course, autonomy is way overemphasized in our culture, that I should make my own morality. Well, it kind of gets snuck into Veritatis Splendor, but there's this concept of participated theonomy, and it's described this way. Others speak, and rightly so, of theonomy, or participated theonomy, since man's first obedience to God's law effectively implies that human reason and human will participate in God's wisdom and providence. This is such a beautiful truth, that since we're made in the image and likeness of God, why wouldn't his rules, laws, be friendly to us? We're made in his image. So whatever he thinks is right, we should think is right, because we're made in his image. The only reason we don't, of course, is because of original sin, which is not just a thing, but that is what prevents us from saying hooray anytime we hear something that God teaches us to be true, because we want to act in accord with a lower nature. And so that's a quick touchdown into Veritatis Splendor and the notion of conscience and the relation of conscience to universal norms. Now, a place where we can go, surprisingly, to some extent, for an understanding of consciousness is John Paul II's book, Sources of Renewal. I'm going to smile for this guy, and then maybe he'll go away. Oh, you can do more. You can stay, and if you get some more good ones like that. But I think I'm going to look at you for a minute. Okay. How's that?
That's great.
That's good. See, I knew you were trying hard, and I'm looking over here, and it's not working. Okay? Consciousness, hooray, dignity, human person, joy. Thank you. You're a good sport. Thank you. All right, so there's this book, Sources of Renewal. Not too many people look at this book, and it's really, there's a lot of riches there. It's what John Paul II wrote in 1972. It was probably written before then, but it was his program for implementing Vatican II in the Church of Poland, right? And what he wanted to see achieved on the basis of Vatican II in the diocese of and parishes of Poland. And the purpose of the book really is to say that the purpose of the church is to form not conscious, but consciousness. He uses that word. He says the purpose of the church is to form consciousness. In fact, the title of part 2 of the text is the formation of consciousness, but the host of chapters have it in it. Various titles of chapters are the consciousness of the church as the main foundation of conciliar initiation, right? Again, the purpose of the church is to be conscious of different things and teach consciousness. We're going to talk about the consciousness of creation. That's not that creation needs to be conscious, but we need to be conscious of what creation is. Christ and the consciousness of redemption. The consciousness of the church as people of God, ad intra and ad extra. The historical and eschatological consciousness of the church as the people of God. So it's a good place to look for this ethical notion of consciousness. So he says the question of Vatican II is phrased this way. The question, what does it mean to be a believing member of the church, is indeed difficult and complex, because it not only presupposes the truth of faith, it should be and pure doctrine, but also calls for that truth to be situated in the human consciousness, and calls for a definition of the attitude, that's another big word in this text, consciousness and attitude, or rather the many attitudes that go to make the individual a believing member of the church. So consciousness is very important to our being a believing member of the church. And he says about the present study, he says, in the present study, designed to help towards the realization of Vatican II, we shall concentrate on the consciousness of Christians and the attitudes they should acquire. These attitudes, springing from a well-formed Christian conscience, can in a sense be regarded as true proof of the realization of the council. Right? So again, the purpose of the council is to help the church become conscious of its duty to form consciousnesses. Okay, so he talks about that this is a fully personal thing. Man is the subject of an encounter with God who reveals himself. These ideas point to the human depth and which distinguishes man as a person, and which is implied by faith. Thus they concern the dimension of the human person, which in conscious faith is manifest in all its fullness. Slight comment here, but I mean, we know that the pews are filled, honestly, with Catholics who don't have much of a conscious faith. They don't really know what they believe, and they're not really letting that faith determine their actions, let alone a host of Catholics that are not in the pews who have no consciousness of what their faith is. And he speaks about the ethical significance of this consciousness. He says the consciousness of the faith has not only psychological but ethical significance. It involves a profound sense of responsibility as regards the response to God's self-revelation. Many of us have these epiphanies in our lives where we say, you know, those phrases that you'll read with the saints, since God has given me everything, I owe him everything. It's sort of like, boing, this huge wake-up moment. You become conscious of something. And that consciousness is going to change again every action thereafter, impact every action. He talks again this phrase, conscious faith. He says the postulate of conscious faith as a postulate of the enrichment on the subject's part is nothing but a constant concern on man's part to respond to the God who reveals himself. Consciousness, I am made in the image and likeness of God. I'm God's redeemed daughter. Right? I'm conscious of the truth that he wants me to live. I'm conscious that I can choose to do that. This is all this part of this consciousness. He also speaks in this text of conscious Catholicism. I somehow lost my text that I wanted to use on that, but just to think of that beautiful phrase, I'm a conscious Catholic. I know that Sherry Waddell and her program, Intentional Discipleship, there might be something to this. I'm an intentional disciple. I know what I'm about, in a sense. All right, so now we move to Humanae Vitae, and this curious phrase, conscious parenthood. Some of you know what one of the launchings of my into defending Humanae Vitae was when I retranslated Humanae Vitae, which is an incredibly bold, if not presumptuous, thing to do. Right? But I went to look at the document, and I found some passages I didn't think were translated well. That was originally all the foreign language translations were based upon the Italian text, and the Latin text came out later, and translations weren't done on that text. They were based on the Italian text. And I went to the passage that said, in each and every act must remain open to procreation. And I looked at the Latin, and it said each and every act must be per se destinatus, per se destinatus. And I thought, no Latinist would say open. I mean, who the heck got open out of that? And then I went to the Italian text, and it said aperto, which means open. The store is open, church is open, aperto. And I thought it means something very different. Per se destinata absolutely roots it into the Thomistic tradition of an act having a telos. So I went back and started looking at the beginning and see if there are other things. I'll talk a bit about the first line. But it wasn't until actually years later that when that translation was maybe 10 years old, maybe longer, after I'd read Love and Responsibility, and I discovered this phrase, conscious parenthood, consciousness. And then I remembered translating Humanae Vitae in the section on responsible parenthood. And the Latin is, we'll see it in a minute, I should put it here, is conscia paternitas. And I thought, I didn't know how to translate that then. I didn't know what conscia paternitas meant, but all the translations said responsible parenthood. I said, well, I'm going to go with responsible parenthood, that sounds good. But then I read Love and Responsibility, I said, that doesn't get it. That doesn't capture it. If anybody can come up with a better phrase than conscious parenthood, which is peculiar, maybe that's a benefit of it. It makes people ask, what the heck does that mean? Because we think we know what responsible parenthood means. We know we don't know what conscious parenthood means. It's, maybe finally you get awake or something. It's conscious parenthood. Because today I'm conscious, I'm awake. It means much more than that. All right, so what does it mean? In Love and Responsibility, it's all over the place. I'm only choosing one or two texts. It says their sexual marital relations have the character of a true union of persons. This is the moral quality. Sexual marital relations have the character of a true union of persons as long as a general disposition towards parenthood is not excluded from them. This is very much what Professor Federica answered to a question she had the other day. It's like, how conscious do you have to be of this? He's saying the consciousness means a general, in this instance, a general disposition. Underlying that, he says, this implies a conscious attitude to the sexual instinct. To master the sexual urge means just this. to accept its purpose in marital relations. There's so much that's great in love and responsibility. He moves from the term saying that the purpose of sex is to bring forth a new human person, or not, it's no longer a new human being. He then moves to saying the purpose is to bring forth a new human person, right? Not just another member of the species, but someone who's absolutely unique with an immortal soul. But then he uses the phrase, the purpose of sex is to make parents out of people, right? The purpose of sex is to make parents out of people. So it's saying not just I'm bringing forth someone, I'm bringing forth someone with whom I have now a lifetime responsibility with another person, all right? So he wants that principle to rule all of sexual morality. Again, is this act putting myself into a parental relationship with another person who I believe to be worthy of being the parent of my children or children? All right, am I in a state where I can be a good parent with this other person with whom I'm going to engage in sex with? Can you imagine what that would do to sexual relationships? It's all over the place in Humanae Vitae. I mean, love and responsibility. It's very much also in Humanae Vitae. This passage comes from another essay, which we're moving to Humanae Vitae, but again, I want to look at passages that influenced it. This is from Wojtyła's essay on the anthropological vision of Humanae Vitae. He said, man becomes capable of seeing in a more mature way the authenticity, the reasonableness, and the beauty of the objective moral order when he conceives it with his own conscience as subject. Perhaps then is accomplished precisely what St. Thomas Aquinas wanted to express by speaking of the participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. Again, that with our consciousness, we see that we can act upon this truth. He says the encyclical Humanae Vitae follows the same direction, postulating that man observes with intelligence and love the laws written by God in his nature. Again, we find this as a part of our being. Again, back a minute just to love and responsibility. Man is a rational being, and to aspire to the fullest possible participation of his consciousness and all that he does is consonant with his nature, right? Part of our rationality is that we're wanting to be conscious of our rationality and what that means. That what it obliges, how it makes for our greatness and how it obliges us to a certain behavior. This applies equally to the aspiration to become a mother or a father. No distinctions must be made here, with conscious intent. A man and a woman who have marital relations must know when and how they may become parents and regulate their sexual life accordingly. They have a responsibility for every conception, not only to themselves, but also to the family which they are founding or increasing by that conception. Humanae Vitae, the very first sentence of Humanae Vitae says, and this is one that caused me very much to retranslate it. The English version based upon the Italian spoke about entrusting spouses with the very serious duty of transmitting human life, the very serious duty. Now, most people don't like duties, right? That they're sort of nasty things. It's an important duty. I have to pay my bills on time. I have to clean my room. That's my duty. When I looked at it in the Latin, it said that God has entrusted spouses with the extremely important mission, the gravissimum munus. Again, no Latinist would really translate munus as duty. Much more likely to translate it as gift, right? Now, I have various reasons I can tell you later why I translate it as mission, but it's something extremely important that we're meant to do. God has entrusted spouses with the extremely important mission of transmitting human life, working with God. In fulfilling this mission, spouses freely and consciously render a service to God, the Creator. I have many spouses, when they hear this, it transforms their understanding of what their role is in this world, what they're meant to do. Say, wow, I'm working with God. God's given me an incredibly important thing to do. And I'm helping God achieve his purposes in this universe. Okay, so Humanae Vitae 10 is all about conscious parenthood. Conjugal love requires that spouses be fully aware, that's conscious, of their mission of conscious parenthood. Today's society justly calls for conscious parenthood. Thus, it is important that it be rightly understood. Now, if we read the other translations, it's all going to say responsible parenthood. But we now know what conscious means, right? Parenthood's a great thing. I'm performing a great duty, mission for God, right? It goes on to say, God is entrusted, that's there, Humanae Vitae 1. Conscious parenthood, conscia paternitas, means that one knows and honors, this is all in Humanae Vitae. Conscious parenthood, conscia paternitas, means that one knows and honors the responsibilities involved in these processes, biological processes. Human reason has discovered that there are biological laws in the power of procreating life that pertain to the human person. If we then look to the innate impulses and inclinations of the soul, conscious parenthood asserts that it's necessary that reason and will exercise mastery over these impulses and inclinations of the soul. Right? In Humanae Vitae 11, where we get the clearest statement against contraception, if we look further to physical, economic, psychological, and social conditions, conscious parenthood is exercised by those who, guided by prudent consideration and generosity, elect to accept many children. Those are also to be considered conscious parents who, for various reasons and with due respect for moral precepts, decide not to have another child either for a definite or an indefinite amount of time. Yes, I mean, responsible parenthood makes sense in this portion, that you have to limit your family size. He says the limiting of family size is because you're conscious of what parenthood is, that you can't well care as you would like for children at this time. So you're conscious of the great task or munus that parenthood is. I'm almost done. Conscious parenthood, of which you speak here, has another intrinsic foundation of utmost importance. It is rooted in the objective moral order established by God, and only an upright conscience can be a true interpreter of this order, for which reason the mission of conscious parenthood requires that spouses recognize their duties, and that is the word officia, towards God, towards themselves, towards the family, and towards human society, as they maintain a correct set of priorities. Okay, so this is kind of a sampler of these different concepts of conscience, consciousness, and Humanae Vitae, and how they all fit together. And I know some of us are very practical, and we want to ask, well then, how the heck do you form consciousness? Okay? Very important, of course, is instruction. John Paul II is very high on helping people understand things, instructing them, walking them through the truth, through the first principles, through the objective truth, through nature and purposes and telos. Right? Of course, very much are examples, especially within families. Families who are living this reality is an incredibly important way of forming a consciousness. Helping people to pray, learn to pray, and be very much open to God's guidance, and having this pure conscience that can read reality. I've become a bit of an advocate of tattoos. I think we should put above everybody's eyebrow, sex leads to parenthood, okay? Just so no one forgets it, all right? So they can be hyper-conscious of that. All right, thank you very much.